Coming up on a special episode of Why Should I Trust You? Today, we're joined by Dr. Stephen Hoge, the president of Moderna, the biotech company that is all about mRNA technology. It became a household name during the pandemic as it created a COVID vaccine taken by millions and millions of Americans. Moderna is now using that same mRNA platform to try and innovate in treatments for a range of cancers, with promising results being seen for deadly diseases like melanoma and lung cancer. But as we've covered on the show, there is deep mistrust for mRNA technology among many in this country. And then there are those cuts the Trump administration has made to investments in mRNA and the very public break the company had with the FDA over its application to bring a new mRNA-based flu vaccine to the market. So today we ask, is America still a place where a cutting-edge biotech company focused on the promise of mRNA can succeed? How can we trust that pharma companies aren't gaming the system to make their products look better? And is mistrust of pharma's profits and influence misplaced, on target, or a little bit of both? A lot to cover, so let's get started. Hey, welcome, everyone.
Hey, guys.
So this one has been kind of long in the making. We've been chatting with Stephen Hoge. He is the president of the biotech company Moderna. But first, who are we? I'm Brenda Adhikari.
I'm Tom Johnson.
I'm Maggie Bartlett.
And I'm Dr. Mark Abdimalik.
Okay, so in a moment, Dr. Hoge will join us. But Tom, we all know that Moderna became a household name during the pandemic when it was part of Operation Warp Speed and we were lining up to get vaccinated. But just before the president of the company joins us, get us up to speed on Moderna and what we need to know right now.
Yeah, so Dr. Stephen Hoge tells the story of joining Moderna back in 2012. And he says there were just 20 employees. And in 6 months, it wasn't clear they were actually even going to make payroll. They, of course, were founded around this promise of mRNA. We've talked about on the show a lot. mRNA gives your cells the instructions to make proteins, which are what allow your body to function. And scientists had already figured out how to use synthetic mRNA made in the lab as an instruction system and how to package that so that your body wouldn't destroy it before it could go to work. And if you're interested in this, take a spin back to an episode we did with Nobel Prize-winning scientist Dr. Drew Weissman about all that. But when Dr. Hoge, who had worked in ER medicine and some business consulting, was thinking about joining Moderna, he says a whole lot of people told him this bet on mRNA would be a bust. So over the next 8 years, the company experimented, it raised investment, it grew its staff, it built a manufacturing factory, and most importantly, it began to show success using mRNA as a vaccine platform, which was a surprise to them. And despite the years of investment, though, and research, when the ball dropped welcoming in 2020, they had not yet brought a single product to the market. And then COVID hits. And that January, a scientist in China published the genetic code of the virus, and Moderna's team mapped out their vaccine in a matter of hours or just days. They are the first to say they were building on decades of scientific research when they took this mRNA platform up to the finish line, producing this at scale. They were part of Operation Warp Speed, and Moderna's vaccine underwent that large clinical trial in 2020 at the height of the pandemic. And that fall, when the results of that large phase 3 clinical trial were revealed, its vaccine showed a success rate of 94% at reducing symptomatic COVID.
And that number was a flashpoint. I mean, some even considered it a home run, but we all know that that number also became a triggering point, because if the vaccine was argued to be so effective, why were people still getting COVID?
That's right. So in December of that year, FDA grants them emergency use authorization for its mRNA vaccine. Again, another super controversial thing in the months and years ahead. Soon their shots were going into arms, and it was, considered a staggering success to stand up this vaccine with such speed. By September of 2021, Moderna had produced hundreds of millions of doses of its vaccine worldwide. And this tiny company that only had, a handful of employees when Dr. Hoge joined back in 2012 was suddenly a household name.
Yeah. And, even as the science delivered over this time, and again, and some people would say, scientists would say remarkably well, as we all know very well, skepticism over the mRNA among a portion of the American public began to rise. The whole way that the vaccine came to market through something called the emergency use authorization is still controversial and a talking point for some. There's that rare but real side effect, myocarditis, which especially is in younger males, also raised concern, even though cases were uncommon and typically mild. And studies have found that the risk of myocarditis is much higher after COVID infection than after the vaccine. But Moderna did well by making that vaccine. They reported a $12.2 billion net income for 2021. That's during the pandemic, and profits that remain controversial for some critics. Much to discuss about that with our guest. Now, in polling released by KFF last year, Americans showed a strikingly polarized view of vaccines that use mRNA. And it's on party lines again, as we've talked about before. Half of Democrats, 45%, and independents, 50%, as well as 6 in 10 Republicans say they didn't know enough about mRNA technology to know if it was safe or not. So 52% of Democrats thought the technology was generally safe compared to only 15% of Republicans who agreed. In fact, nearly a quarter of Republicans thought the technology was generally unsafe. Now, and for many Americans, those views weren't just about the technology itself, but it was about who was telling them. It was about trust in the institutions behind the technology. Now, later that year, HHS Secretary Robert Kennedy Jr. made several high-profile moves to scale back federal investment in mRNA vaccine development. Now, in May of last year, the Trump administration, you remember, canceled $766 million that it had awarded to Moderna to develop a vaccine against a potential pandemic influenza virus, including bird flu. Now, HHS said mRNA was under-tested and that, quote, this is not simply about efficacy, it's about safety, integrity, and trust.
And then in August, HHS canceled $500 million worth of funding for mRNA vaccines being developed for flu and COVID by several pharma companies, including Moderna. And then this March, there was the big news that the FDA and Moderna, had come to heads over Moderna's potential mRNA-based flu vaccine. The FDA made big waves and stunned the company, announcing they were not going to review the new vaccine's application for approval. They cited concerns about the way the trial had been designed and what flu vaccine Moderna had chosen to compare the efficacy of their new drug against. This reversed. FDA came back around and said they would review the application, and the company is now hoping that they get approval in August ahead of the next flu season.
Okay, so and finally, now all these headlines and everything we've been talking about so far is dominated by COVID, virus, flu, regulation, politics, fund, put it back. The bigger story may actually be where the technology is headed next, something everybody can rally around, the fight against cancer. Now, to be clear, as of right now, no mRNA-based cancer vaccine has yet received FDA approval, but there are over 100 clinical trials underway or on the books using mRNA technology for all kinds of cancer, including lung, pancreatic, melanoma, brain, breast, bladder, colorectal, you name it. One of the most promising uses of mRNA in cancer is the ability to create a personalized vaccine tailored to your specific mutation in your specific tumor. Personalized care. And there are still big challenges, of course. We can't minimize that. There's cost, there's manufacturing time, there's, do these vaccines work against more advanced cancer? But the field is moving fast, and the first approvals could be here soon. We want to talk to our guest about that today. So Moderna, our guest today, is one of the front runners in all of this. The company has partnered with Merck, and together they are in clinical trials using Moderna's mRNA platform combined with Merck's blockbuster drug Keytruda, which is an immunotherapy, to give patients with advanced melanoma another layer of personalized treatment. Now, immunotherapy revolutionized our treatment for things like melanoma, but adding this in has just made a bigger difference than we even thought could be possible. Just this past January, they announced the results of how patients in their clinical trial are doing 5 years after receiving this combined treatment. Again, the mRNA vaccine plus Keytruda. For these patients, the risk of cancer recurrence and death was reduced by almost 50% compared to Keytruda alone. I mean, the treatment is already being tested in an ongoing phase 3 trial, and Moderna has said that data could come later this year.
Okay, lots to get to with Dr. Stephen Hoge of Moderna. That's coming up next. Okay, Okay, a big why should I trust you? Welcome to Dr. Stephen Hoge. Dr. Hoge began his career as an emergency room doctor in New York City and found his way to joining Moderna in 2012. More than a decade later, as president, he helps lead the company's scientific and medical strategy. Dr. Hoge, welcome to Why Should I Trust You?
Thank you very much for having me.
So Americans want innovative medicines and drugs to help make us healthier and live longer. When, all these news about NIH or proposed cuts to funding for NIH come out, the public doesn't respond very well to it. And yet we hear week in and week out a whole lot of mistrust for the business of bringing these innovations to life. Mistrust of big pharma. I'm sure you've heard of that. Gallup finds that the pharmaceutical industry ranks second to last in Americans' opinions of different industries out of 25. How do you reckon with these two truths?
Well, I think generally as an economy, we tend to love innovation, entrepreneurship, and investing and taking risks as a part of the sort of ethos of America, right? It's even how we do a lot of healthcare. In this country, we've chosen healthcare to be a private sector, largely industry, as opposed to single payer public healthcare systems. But that creates tension, right? Because we have areas where businesses, pharma as an example, biotech as an example, are pursuing profit as the way that we figure out what works best, the way we sort of invest in many things and the winners win. But it creates some tensions because then, whenever folks are successful in that, they're winners. And there's a reasonable public question about when does health need to serve the public good versus the private sector good. And I think pharma and biotech, just like, some other aspects of for-profit healthcare, be it insurance or healthcare delivery. I'm from a family of physicians. They always get that attention, and that may be appropriate because we are a bit of a private sector part of a public good. And so I reconcile it as nobody, sort of remembers the companies that didn't succeed or the ways that people invested money and it didn't pay off and didn't create a vaccine or didn't create a new medicine. But we want that to keep happening, and we therefore tolerate incentives that reward the winners that get there. And then one of the things you have to live with if you get there successful is people will ask, well, how much winning is appropriate? Given all the successes and failures that have happened in the industry. So we have a bit of a winner's problem when we talk about an industry where it's populated by the medicines that came forward and provided a benefit to society. And it's our job to continue to tell that broader story.
So we're going to get back to some of those themes in a bit. But, a few weeks ago, we had Ben Mazur, who's a physician and a reporter for The Atlantic, a journalist for The Atlantic on. And he talked about something that doesn't often get talked about much. And he said, quote, drug companies have a history of going into their clinical trials and choosing a drug that is not necessarily the standard of care to be the one that they compare their new drug against. In other words, they pick a less powerful drug to compare their drug with, so their drug looks even more effective. How can Americans trust companies that do that? He said it's been a big deal in cancer trials. It's easy to tweak the system so it makes your drug look a little better. You don't use the most effective chemotherapy in the control arm, so your drug by default looks a little better. It's a game they play, Ben said, to make their experimental drug look better than it is. So respond to that. How can Americans trust a company or any drug company if that has been in the past?
Yeah. So first, there is at the end of the day, the clinical trials that we run, the registrational clinical trials, are all pre-negotiated with regulators around the world. So I'll use an example of our recent experience. We have to talk to the FDA, but not just the FDA. We're going to commercialize the product in Canada, in Japan, in Europe. And so we have to speak to all of those regulators and understand what is the standard of care that they would want to see in that pivotal clinical trial. And the reality is, there are standards of care that are used in the United States where we are willing to invest more in some of those innovations that may not be available in certain countries in Europe or in other countries which have national health systems that aren't reimbursing them. And so there's a little bit of a part of that, which is actually what is the, if you will, the most common denominator, hopefully not the lowest common denominator, but a common denominator across regulators that makes sense for those clinical trials. And sometimes that does mean in individual markets, it may not be the current best standard of care. Now, the way I'd respond to that is when that happens, the data is transparent. It's not like we don't know what the standard of care is. There is still scientific value in that data. And ultimately, physicians and healthcare providers or patients or payers who would pay for that, get to make their decision about that standard of care and that data. It's not like, if you will, the drug companies that run those studies are hiding what their comparator is. And sometimes there are, as I said, geographic or international reasons why there's a little bit of a comparison. Now, we still need to continue to earn that trust, need to explain that story, and ultimately be very transparent about where that comparator is, and never obviously mislead about where there might be an evolution in the standard of care, where either because after you ran the study or started it, there was a new standard of care that emerged, as often happens in cancer, or alternatively, if there was differences between different geographies, the US or Europe would want a different comparator, that we're transparent about that we explain why we made the choices we did, so that physicians, doctors, patients can make the right choices about whether they want to rely on that data or not.
I guess there's sort of another layer to this one. And it just occurred to me as you were talking, there's one thing when you have a standard of care and a comparator, like in a flu trial. Mm-hmm. And then there's cancer, right? Mm-hmm. Like, people are hanging on the news that there's going to be a breakthrough. Mm-hmm. And they're hanging on those headlines that this far exceeded, this other drug that's on the market. Like, do you worry that there's sort of a false hope that's kind of coming through with companies that choose like a less effective standard of care to compare their new drug with, that it sends people like, and gives them false hope that something amazing is occurring when something good's occurring, but it may not just be as amazing as being presented through these headlines?
Yeah, it's a fair challenge. I think we never want to create false hope, in particular in cancer. I mean, that's from a clinical perspective, from an ethical perspective, nobody wants to. False hope is inherently not something you want. Some of the challenge, the way you just asked that question, is sometimes the headlines aren't actually what the data says, and even isn't necessarily what the company would say or what you hear the investigators say. Because all these clinical trials have a principal investigator who doesn't work for the company. Right? The company sponsors it, but ultimately, particularly in pivotal studies, there are independent views, and they should be heard. Now, there are situations, I'm sure, I know, where maybe companies are trumpeting the better features of their trial and maybe not as objectively characterizing, the relative benefit versus other alternatives. And I think that those are places that we mean to be called to task as an industry. And I hope that, both public health commentators, physicians, key opinion leaders, medical societies, and the media can do that. And I do think that happens. I do think that there are plenty of instances where, whether it's the trade media or medical societies or even just KOLs will say, they're overstating that benefit. And I think that is an appropriate disciplining that happens. No, I don't think people go out wanting to create false hope, but I certainly can appreciate that sometimes that does happen. I would just say, we all want bigger innovations. We all want more dramatic and profound improvements. But sometimes if we only swing for the fences, sometimes if you're only swinging for a home run, you miss singles and doubles. And so there is some value in singles and doubles and making incremental improvements. We just need to not over trumpet those. So it's not like it's necessarily a bad thing for our healthcare system that we get on base, but we need to make sure that we don't call that a home run.
I mean, when you use language like home run, and I think you actually go back to 2021, or I think 2021, and you literally use that word about the COVID vaccine. Like, you thought maybe it'd be 50% effective, maybe 75% effective, and then the number came in at like 95% effective, and it was like elation, home run. And I think that you said we have to be careful about how we use that language, and science is about precision. Like we talk in, scientists, unfortunately, we talk in zeros and ones, and we code and we Excel sheet, all this kind of stuff. And we know 1 + 1 = 2, right? But then, like, if you add in like the humanity of it and like getting people on board, like suddenly 1 + 1 could equal 3. And it makes it a much bigger win. Now, looking back, like, how did that go to the point where, was it storytelling? Was it science? Like, how has this sort of misinformation or, confusion about the efficacy of the vaccine, how was that able to take hold given the science was what you called a home run.
Yeah. Well, it was we went through something as a world and as a society. And yeah, there's a lot of looking backwards that you'd say like, oh, it probably needed more nuance in that characterization. But in those moments, there was a lot of elation. I mean, a lot of us were just getting our lives back. And so home run as language, I think it described the feeling in the moment, but maybe didn't, maybe as you rolled it forward, needed a lot more nuance from a public health messaging perspective. I mean, I just, take that on myself first. The reality is that, there were a lot of more nuanced messages that didn't puncture through. I'll use an example. I think it was the end of March or early April of 2021, before most people had even had their first dose of a COVID vaccine, right? And we're just starting to get that first dose if you were high risk in the United States, and wasn't really available everywhere else in the world. We actually did it at an analyst day. We have to talk to the shareholders, and I gave a talk as a part of that where we could pull up that slide. It's an entertaining one, but where I described what I thought the pandemic would look like, what we thought the epidemiology of and effectiveness of the vaccine would be over time. And if you went back and looked at that moment in time, 3 months after that phase 3 result, we described it as there would likely be variant evolution, waves of subsequent infection requiring boosters. And if you played it forward, and I think we said in sort of 24, this would become a seasonal booster that would really provide value for those at high risk, particularly over the age of 65, the young and the immune compromised. But that otherwise it would sort of become, a milder disease. Now that was kind of the position we were taking long before most people even got their dose, the more nuanced position. But it didn't have the headline value of 95% efficacy, right? And so a lot of things were like, get vaccinated, COVID gone. And this idea of, no, this is a coronavirus. There's hundreds of years. There's 4 circulating endemic ones. We kind of know how this plays and where it modulates out over a couple of years and where it goes. And that message, I really wish we'd done a better job, because what happened then, to your question, is people sort of got their primary vaccination. And then 12 months later, when the virus decided to change its stripes, everybody's like, whoa, you told me it was 95% effective. And now you tell me.
What do you wish you had said? Like, if you could get a do-over, what do you wish you had said?
I wish we'd emphasized more that this wasn't a moment in time, that we were going to have to evolve into a more balanced relationship with this virus, and we would beat it, but it wasn't going to be a single vaccine that was going to do it. And we needed to level with people about what that was going to look like over a few years. And so that folks could make their own decision in that phase. We also need to do a more nuanced job on, candidly, on the role of prior infection, providing some of the protection against the most severe outcomes already. And I think there was, that wasn't as much a company one, that was more of a general public health one. And risk-based use of the vaccines and interventions, because there was a strong desire to get everything sort of cleared. But the reality is there were plans that were much more risk-based about how you protect those that are really burdening hospitals and healthcare systems or people on the front lines. And that got lost.
Just to sneak one more point in that we hear all the time, which is 94, 95% effective. Then how am I still getting COVID? Like that very basic explanation that this isn't going to prevent you from getting infected. It's going to keep you, hopefully, God willing, out of the hospital.
Right.
That got lost.
Totally. And we screwed up in some ways because we didn't anticipate. Again, I go back to that April 1st presentation. It's like, we were saying you were going to need a booster because we knew the virus would evolve. It wasn't going to stay the Wuhan strain of the virus. We didn't know it was going to be Delta or Omicron or whatever it was going to be, but we knew it was going to evolve. But I think we weren't leveling with people about that.
And is that a function of the mRNA technology, or is that just a function of like our human bodies? I mean, look, if you talked about boosters, there aren't that many people getting boosters right now. Right. I mean, it's like, your entire business model, I don't know how many billions of doses you're making. Are you guys just like dialing down the production lines of these boosters just simply because people aren't getting them? I mean, it's like only like 18% of adults greater than 18 are getting them. I think a quarter of like all adults age 65, I think, has a little bit higher percentage of people getting them. But if this is so perfect. And like this mRNA technology, we can just copy and paste. COVID virus changes, perfect. We'll just tweak our formula here, make a new booster, put it out. Why aren't people getting it? Do we not need it? Do you think we not need it as much because of what you just said about prior infection? Or is it something just out of the science realm? Like, what are you guys talking about why we're not getting it?
Well, look, I'd start by saying the answer is different in different countries. And so, just north of the border in Canada or in UK, you'll see higher vaccination rates. In the US, it is lower. It's not necessarily inappropriate for healthy people without risk factors to choose not to, right? Like that's a place where I think we got the messaging wrong 4 or 5 years ago. People were more scared of the virus and all that. You had first experiences. But for those over the age of 65 or with risk factors, as an example, and age is a risk factor, the problem is their immune systems are going to have a hard time catching up with a COVID infection. And the problem is that a decent percentage of the time that will result in a hospitalization. And if they have other comorbidities, heart disease, cancer, lung disease, name it, they could end up, dying. And we had still had 40,000 deaths in 24. The vaccines are still massively effective at preventing hospitalization. Most recent publications are even showing that, not just ours. But it really is focused in that higher risk population, 65 plus. So when people throw out numbers like, whatever it was that you just said, 10 or 18% of all adults, it's also true for RSV vaccines in adults. It's also true that vaccines are much less frequently used by healthy younger adults than older adults. And I think that might be the right way to think about how you use preventative measures against respiratory infections, in particular, targeting it towards older and high risk folks. I still think people should be able to choose it for themselves, and not just me, or my family, but people should be able to have access to these products and use them if they want. But I don't think it's necessarily, incorrect from a public health perspective. And if you look to other countries, that's kind of where they've pushed their recommendations, which is we really feel strongly about it if you're over the age of 65 or over the age of 75.
So is Moderna taking its eye off the ball or taking its foot off the pedal or whatever you want to say in terms of just like investing and looking for mRNA improvements for the COVID vaccines? Are you guys like, I know we're going to talk about cancer in a little bit, and I know we talked about flu. Are you guys as a company saying, you know what, with this climate here and just, all of these nuances, it's not worth us putting that much effort into the COVID vaccine mRNA anymore?
Well, I guess get back to the private sector part of how we invest in innovation in this economy in this country. You can't invest in things that the market doesn't want. And if people don't want to see continued improvements, then more generally, then of course we shouldn't be trying to make them. That doesn't mean that we're not investing. So we brought forward a new COVID vaccine. Actually, it was approved last year. It became our leading product in the U.S. It's called mNEXSpike, but it's an engineered version of the vaccine that doesn't have all the spike protein stuff that we think was creating some of the problem, and really just focuses on two parts: the receptor binding domain and the N-terminal domain. And actually showed a statistically significantly better protection for seniors and those with risk factors against everything from COVID to hospitalization. And even now there's some real world data that we've just put up on a preprint that's getting published, showing that it's actually superior in the real world. And that innovation we think is great. It's a lower dose. It doesn't have all the other spike protein garbage. It's more targeted.
Wait, you just called spike protein garbage. Hold on. You just called spike protein garbage.
All of the other parts of it that weren't necessary for protection against infection or against, the COVID-19.
But wait, so are you saying, I want to, this is really fascinating to me because are you saying that the newer version of the COVID vaccines could potentially have less spike protein, which some people have said could be, some of the reason for some of the side effects? So as the vaccine, the COVID mRNA vaccine changed a bit for the better because of what we've learned.
We invested in that. It's called mNEXSpike. It does not contain the full spike protein. In fact, it doesn't contain really any of what you would consider the spike protein. It just contains a couple pieces. We've never, to date, in clinical trials, we haven't seen things like myocarditis or pericarditis. We haven't seen, a signal of that in the real world. And we were able to lower the dose by, it down to essentially 20%. It went from 50 micrograms to 10 micrograms. So 80% lower dose, 1/5 the dose. And we think that's a good innovation to have. We made those investments. We started making those investments 4 years ago as we were all having our first experiences and said, we should try to do better. And that product was approved in the United States last year. It's now approved in other countries, and it's available.
Why aren't you shouting this from the rooftops?
He is here.
He's saying it here.
I guess I'm here. Yeah.
Let me ask you about that, because I want to separate out a couple of things. There is clearly a campaign to very critical of mRNA technology. And even when the COVID vaccine first came out, there was a lot of information, pretty wild out there facts about aborted fetal cells and microchips and things
changing
like
your
that.
DNA. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think we can put that. I'm comfortable. I don't think that's good information. You can call it misinformation, whatever. The thing that it often gets lumped into by, in my estimation, many folks in public health is when folks have a genuine concern about the vaccine, where they're getting terrible side effects. I mean, I remember getting, now I got Pfizer, to be fair, but I got pretty bad side effects. And or what you just said, which is it's not crazy to not take a vaccine if you're healthy and below the age of 65. Now, I guess I would love for you to, hindsight's 2020, but that's not the advice you would have given in 2020, it seems. In 2020, you would have said, everybody should get this vaccine, or in 2021. But in hindsight, are you saying that even back then, if folks were healthy and got the virus and had natural immunity from that, they may not have needed to get the vaccine? Because that's a big point. We have a lot of MAHA listeners and stuff. And when you kind of push away the aborted fetal cells and microchips and all that stuff, and you just talk about the vaccine, a lot of them was, tell us, I'm healthy, I got the virus, I don't feel like I need to get this vaccine, and why are people calling me anti-vaccine? What goes through your mind when you hear that?
The hindsight is always 2020, and so it's a bit of a difficult question, because looking back, I think we've learned a lot that we didn't know back then that would suggest that, certainly if people had natural immunity, they could have made a very different decision, particularly if they didn't have risk factors, particularly if they were healthy and probably didn't expose themselves to, much risk with subsequent infections. Now, there were people who unfortunately, passed away after a second infection of COVID and weren't protected by the first, but that also happened, to be fair, with people who were vaccinated. And so, it is a reality of the fact that, the virus evolved a lot over those first 3 years in human circulation. And we were all trying to figure out what the right answer was. I would say that I'm sure I wasn't always perfect at this, but as a company, we tried to always say the decision of how you use our product or any of these vaccines is very much for public health officials to make. It is not for the company to decide. And, our job is to generate, and we tried to say this consistently, not saying it was always perfect, to generate data, to provide that to the government and public health, and then healthcare providers and public health need to decide how to use it. In some countries, that was more permissive and said, look, if you got natural infection, we are not going to require you to get vaccinated. In this country, we took again, public health officials, not the company, took a different approach. And so one of the challenges I think we have as a company, and Moderna and mRNA as well, is we're tagged a lot with those choices that we had nothing to do with. We really weren't. mRNA had nothing to do with a mandate. It had nothing to do with, the CDC recommendations or even, other employer or otherwise recommendations about how these things got used. We were responsible for generating the data, for the studies, for providing that. But from there forward, particularly during the pandemic, we made the doses and we delivered them to the government. We didn't even get them to customers. We delivered them to the government for almost 3 years straight, and that was our job. And that was all we were, being told or asked to do. And I think it's inappropriate for us to go much beyond that. Now, sometimes people ask us our opinions. Of course, I got vaccinated and boosted and still do. And of course, we kind of made our own choices. But a lot of the things that, for whatever reason, I don't want to, it's not fair for me to second guess why public health officials made choices or made different choices, because honestly, I don't know what they were looking at as they made those choices. But I can see how, in retrospect, some countries made more permissive choices, and it seems to work out fine. And others were a little bit more prescriptive, like we were here, and it seems to have created a lot more of a reaction to those recommendations. But I don't think that's an mRNA thing. It just tags that way.
We, when we were preparing for this, we shared a speech you gave, a lovely speech you gave to your, I think it was your boarding school. And we sort of got to know you a little bit through that speech. You talked about being an optimist and how that was a gift you were given, and it kind of fuels you. We've now talked about mRNA. You saw incredible promise in that. You joined the company, went through some long years, hard work. Moderna becomes a household name. mRNA, you deliver the shot. It does incredible benefit, but it also kind of goes sideways for some Americans. Like they don't trust it. They're not optimistic. They're skeptical about it.
Yeah.
Now you guys are, and you've been doing this for years now, pivoted towards cancer. Are you optimistic that mRNA as a tool in battling cancer is going to work for Americans, that they are going to believe that? Maybe the stakes are so high for somebody who's terrified that cancer is going to come back after they've had a surgery, for example. Or are you a little more guarded now in that optimism? Are you guarded that, mRNA can be seen as something that's just off, that's just not right, that there's something I don't trust about it? I mean, where are you on your optimism?
Yeah. And it wasn't my boarding school, for the record. I just got asked to give a talk.
Oh, okay.
So yeah. Thank you I'm embarrassed that you guys read that or are aware of that. No. But a lot of those, inherently optimism for me is about a belief that you can make the future better, and that regardless of the circumstance where you start that exercise, the question is whether or not you have faith that through hard work, and maybe you won't see it to the end, that you're going to make an improvement. And I still believe that. Now, you describe the narrative as, we have this incredible impact, and then we have this sort of hangover, however you else want to describe it, this reality that, for the first time, people understand what technology their medicines have in them. I mean, think about that as a bizarre statement. Like most people, they don't really know whether it's a recombinant protein or a peptide or, a lipid-based emulsion. Like they don't really think of, and even in vaccines, is it a viral vector or protein, or is it adjuvanted? Those things are kind of in the background. Like 4 billion people received an mRNA vaccine and knew, they were told that it was an mRNA vaccine. And that's a profound change in consciousness about what's in the technology. And all of a sudden people are like, well, do I have an opinion about that? And it's not at all surprising that people have opinions about the technology because they had experiences with it. But they never previously had those links. I guess the question as I look to the midterm and long term on things like cancer and stuff like that for me is, but is that going to continue to happen in that way? Are 4 billion people going to have this piercing consciousness experience of and it's new and it's a technology and this is what it is? Or are people going to return to working with their physicians and saying, what are the treatment options for me? And what are the benefits and risks of those? And what do you recommend? And what do I choose to do for myself? And as you get more to that kind of an interaction, I actually think it's less about we went through a pandemic or a world sort of shaping event and here's a technology, and much more about what's right for me. And let's have a conversation about the facts around that. And I think in that space, frankly, it starts to matter no more that it's mRNA than it's a monoclonal antibody made in a bioreactor or an antibody developed, drug conjugate that has a little piece of chemotherapy attached to it, which people don't really think about for other approaches to treating cancer. Now, I'm personally quite passionate about the science of what we do, and I think one of the things that gets lost in some of that piercing public health narrative around mRNA is actually the science is amazingly supportive on safety and efficacy, right? And the amount of study that's gone into this platform is unrivaled. Nearly every OECD government has separately studied this and published on it in their populations. France came out with a 5-year longitudinal study and showing that receiving the mRNA COVID vaccines, both ours and Pfizer's, not just Moderna, reduced all kinds of burdens of disease, including, by the way, incidentally cancer versus having had a natural infection or other things. Now, some of that is always the problem with epidemiology studies, but what you can say for sure is they didn't see any increased risk in autoimmune disease or some of these other things. And obviously you had the benefit in COVID. You just don't get that with other technology platforms. And so I'm kind of proud of the science. And I do think at some point we should make sure that story, the truth is out there, but it doesn't change the fact that if people have had a different experience about it, that was real for them, whether that was reactogenicity or side effects or maybe a safety event, because those things happen, certainly myocarditis, pericarditis, other things like that, that shapes their perspective on it. And it can and should going forward. I just don't know that that's going to translate into a conversation with your doctor and your oncologist about cancer treatment in the way that you described. And our job is just to keep creating data.
Yeah, I mean, I have that conversation every day about cancer, about melanoma with my patients. And I want you to help us understand exactly what is happening with mRNA and cancer, because I think, like you just said, all of those words for viruses, recombinant, viral, protein, don't use any of those words, and just tell me what mRNA is going to do and has done and has been shown in these trials with cancer. You kind of just set the stage for us so we can get into a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So the thing that we are most excited about this year is we have at least one large phase 3 trial in melanoma, skin cancer, that'll read out. We have other studies in lung cancer and other things that'll read out subsequently. But this year, where we had previously run a phase 2 trial, large randomized phase 2 trial against the standard of care, the gold standard of care, Keytruda, where we showed whether or not we could prevent relapse or recurrence of somebody's melanoma. And this is somebody who's had it surgically removed, but we know it's in a lymph node, so it's moved out of the local site. That's their stage 3 disease. And we know that unfortunately that will relapse at a reasonably high rate and often relapse as a distant metastasis, and that's a concern, even with immune therapies. And what we're able to show with our program, which I'll describe in a minute, is a 50% reduction, 49% reduction in the rate of relapse or death in a relatively large, well-controlled, randomized, blinded phase 2 trial. We're now trying to confirm that. And the real question is, how can you get to that kind of a profound improvement in relapse or death? And the answer is decades of work and only about 10 of those at Moderna. That decades of work has been going on in the broader field of cancer, looking at, well, somebody relapses or doesn't relapse. What's the difference? And one of the things that people worked out over really the last 25 years is the immune system. Your immune system is fundamental for controlling and defeating your cancer, from preventing it from coming back. And we can do things to help it with immune therapies and things like that. We can do things to help it by surgically cutting out part of the cancer and with radiation and even chemo to create inflammation. But ultimately, it's your immune system that attacks that cancer. You say, well, what happens? Why doesn't it always work? And the reason it doesn't always work is sometimes your immune system can't recognize the cancer as cancer. It just sees it as a part of your body. And that inability to see cancer prevents it from clearing it from your body. And that's where you see these relapses, often post-surgery or post-adjuvant treatment. So people worked out, well, how do we help your immune system see that? And you used to think about all the mutations that cancer has. And it turns out the mutations that really matter, we think, are private. They're individual. They're a feature of your cancer. I sometimes describe these as like the freckles on your face. We all acquire freckles. They kind of define what we look like. And each of ours are different. Every individual cancer. If I have a melanoma or somebody else has a melanoma, we end up with different mutations. We call them neoantigens, but they're ultimately the fingerprint or the defining feature of your cancer. And so in order to teach your immune system to kill your cancer, I have to teach it about your specific cancer. I can't take an off-the-shelf drug. And so what I have to do is I have to create a vaccine or medicine that actually matches your cancer. And in order to do that, we have to take a biopsy of your cancer. We sequence it. We find all of these, if you will, mutations or freckles that define it. And then we create a product just for you and as an individual that is effectively a vaccine that teaches your immune system what your cancer looks like. And we have to get it back to you within about a month. And every time we make a product, we make it once and never again, because we make it for you individually. And that burden the challenge of doing that has been something that we've never really scientifically as a field been able to do anything with. But because messenger RNA as a platform is so flexible and we can actually do that, we started 10 years ago building the capabilities to do that. And we've now, in our clinical trials, treated over 1,700 people across a range of skin cancer, lung cancer, and other things in 40 countries. And the thing is, every product is different. We take a biopsy of your cancer and then make a drug for you.
So what you're describing is, mRNA finally being a viable tool to actually get us to the personalized medicine that we not only want, but we need to beat like an advanced cancer.
Right, exactly.
And it's very complicated. And the question I have is, when can people see something like this actually be able to be applied to that patient-physician relationship that you just described? So when they come to see us, it'll be an option. I know there's been dates out there, but I'm wondering if you can give us a better sense of when this might be available.
Well, so first we have to prove, back to the data threshold, we have to prove objectively in a phase 3 trial. And that phase 3 trial, as I said, has been running globally. And we do expect the first interim analysis this year in 2026. We haven't guided more specifically, but we, because we don't actually control it, we're blinded to it. And ultimately, an independent data and safety monitoring board will tell us, you've now got the cases, and here's your result. We hope it matches the phase 2. From there, our job is to submit it for approval. So start in the U.S. with the FDA. We will work our butts off to have that happen quickly with our partner Merck. Merck, who has a very large and established cancer business, and so we're proud to be working with them. And then we and Merck will have to wait for the FDA to tell us that it's appropriate and we've met their bar for efficacy and safety, and then it can be available in the market. And so many of those steps are outside of my control. In the best case scenario, our results are positive this year, and within a year, it becomes, so next year, it could become commercially available. But again, that really depends upon first the data, and then second, an independent review by the FDA.
And there won't be any snafus like the flu vaccine one, because you were talking to the FDA then about making sure all the steps are being followed. Is there a similar path there, or is it a different trajectory, different teams? Like, how does that conversation look?
Obviously, there are different teams, different offices, and I'd say we work very closely with regulators, including the FDA, even now, and we have to, because if you will, they're the umpires. They call the balls and strikes, and we need them to do that. Everybody needs them to do that. And so the partnership we have around even the flu vaccine, we appreciate, because at the end of the day, we're moving forward with that review. We found a way to address their question, and we're moving forward and trying to make our. I'm happy to talk about flu too. We think we have a great flu vaccine. We want to make it available for Americans as a choice. I think in the cancer vaccine space, or the INT, individualized neoantigen treatment, that's what I mean, INT. That's what we call it, because it really is made just for you. That partnership continues, and we're engaged with not just FDA, but EMA and regulators around the world. And I think we're in good shape, but it'll all depend upon the data. That's the way it should
hold on the sort of the amazingness of what you're describing, because I think a lot of people listening are going to be hanging on this.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought maybe we could just go a tiny bit into just how this works, this combo platter that you guys are testing and seeing. It's early, but seeing really incredible results. Like the Keytruda, and I'll put it in a Star Wars metaphor for Maggie. Mm-hmm. Like that's sort of like a drug that says, we're going to lower the deflector shield of the tumor.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Right. And at the same time, then your mRNA is specific to you, patient. Yeah. Your specific, there's a specific like genetic code of your cancer.
Yeah.
And if in the years after your surgery, body, immune system, amazing. If you ever detect anything like this, you attack and the shield will be down and you can go in.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's right.
That's the concept.
I think it's to thank you for that, to sort of build on that. And I like the Star Wars analogy, but it's one step further. Another analogy would be it's like the Keytruda, the immune therapies, the off-the-shelf drugs we have, like Keytruda, raise the threat level. right? Like we have a raised threat level. People should be concerned. But they don't tell you what you're looking for. They just tell you that there's a raised threat level or lower the shield for the tumor. What we're doing is we're creating a mugshot of actually who you're looking for.
And go for this.
Yeah,
When you see it, go to work.
This is the criminal or the terrorist, the thing you're looking for. So there's the general threat level, but then there's like here's what you need to go after.
So 5 years in, you're seeing that the immune system in these patients' bodies, more often than not, are using that mRNA instruction to go and eliminate any kind of recurrence.
And what we can measure is we can show that I'll continue the metaphor, that we use that mugshot to train your immune system. And so your T cells, if you will, the police, you're going, they can see it. They're like, I can see exactly that thing. I know exactly what that, if you will, threat looks like, that person looks like. And they persist in the body. And then if you follow people for 5 years, they will have had half the rate of relapse or death, which is pretty profound, right? I'm sort of, almost doubling their responses. And so that's the metaphor. But in order to do that, the problem is the mugshot for each individual tumor is unique. It's not like a general sort of scope of like, we're looking for people with hats or beards or whatever. It's like, no, I have to go create the one that's just for you. And that has been the thing that other technologies have struggled with. The science of this was developed and conceptualized elsewhere, but you couldn't build the platforms to do it until we got to mRNA.
All right, Dr. Hoge, final question. It's the year 2045. There is a new virus, a new novel virus. It's been detected in a, let's say, a market in like France. In cheese, like cheese. Anyway, it's been detected in a wheel of brie, and it made its way to the United States, and like we're in it again. And now the government's like, all right, Moderna, back to it. We need a vaccine. Are you guys like, fuck no, we're not doing this again? Or are you guys like, we're going to do this again, but here's what we want to tell the American people? Go.
Well, it's the latter. I don't think I'm starting with the curse and the no. And I, I don't know if I'll still be here in 20 years. So it's hard for me to tell you what
Steven, you're a young man.
Oh, you're generous. It's not as young as it looks. Look, I'd say, if I were in the role 20 years from now, and there is a public health threat, we should use science and honest, transparent communication to try and address it. And I do believe our platform has shown the ability to do that. And as a citizen, as a father, as a sibling, like I would want to step in and try and do the right thing for my community. And as an American, I'd want to do it for this country. And I think that that's ultimately what motivated us moving forward. Was the world was under assault, and anybody who could help stepped forward. And it wasn't just companies. And we were just, this is the way we can step forward. So I can't imagine a world where we say, piss off. Now, I hope at that moment, first of all, you hope that moment never happens, but it will, because it does. Every 15, 20 years, there's some threat like that. I hope at that moment, whoever is doing it, whether it's me or somebody else, learns the lessons from this last experience where, in 1918, we couldn't stop the Spanish flu. It just ripped around the world and a lot of people died, and it was traumatic, and there were years of social disruption afterwards, right? In 2020, we could actually stop COVID. And it had a whole different sort of thing, which is the technologies we use to stop it and the approaches we use from public health weren't perfect. And there's some baggage associated with that. So maybe in 2046, if there's a new threat, people will learn from both of those and say, well, now we have tools, but how we use those tools and communicate about that has to be nuanced, and we have to be more sophisticated about how we even deploy them and admit what we know and don't know. And maybe that'll solve the problem, or maybe there'll be a new learning that we have after that. So, but I think I would hope we learn from the past experience and improve.
Is what keeps you up at night about mRNA, is it the science or is it the social stuff?
What keeps me up? We have a lot of work to do on the social stuff. But what keeps me what I like being awake about is the science, is thinking about are we doing the right things for the future? Because I hope, I'm an optimist, that we can show we've learned the social lessons of the past, and that they don't define our future. They're just things that we have to, own and move forward from. And that moving forward for me is about moving forward in a scientific direction. It's about generating new medicines and new innovations, and hopefully in cancer. And we've got a rare disease product in phase 3, and kids that we're hoping to keep out of the hospital get liver transplants, which we're showing, we're really excited about. And that we focus on those sorts of things, because that actually makes the future better. And maybe don't lose too much more time appropriately reflecting on the mistakes of the past.
I'll just end on this one thought, Stephen, which is I think that one possible way to work on the quote social stuff is maybe as a company even reaching out to those communities and having those conversations, because I think what we've learned on this show is while there is misinformation out there. There's terrible, people who are weaponizing bad, really scary stuff that is scaring a lot of this population. But what we're seeing is way more just regular people who kind of were scared to take a vaccine that came out really fast, were threatened that they were going to be fired if they didn't take it,
right.
Took it, got it anyway, took it, still ended up in the hospital, all that kind of stuff that then got weaponized by the really kind of bad faith actors. So then now they're kind of in that camp. But I'd say there's and we're happy to be a facilitator if you want, but there are people who are really interested in engaging in those good faith dialogues about how I want to be able to trust this medication, but I just need to understand it a little bit better. Can public health help you guys with those conversations? So I just put that out there that I think that would go over really well.
Yeah. Count me in for sure.
Well, okay. Well, I will definitely follow up with you on that. Dr. Stephen Hoge, who is a physician as well as the president of Moderna. Thank you so much for joining us on Why Should I Trust You?
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And I am Brinda Adhikari. That is Tom Johnson, Maggie Bartlett, Dr. Mark Abdul-Malik. That was Why Should I Trust You? Please send questions and comments to whyshoulditrustyou.net. And we will see you back here real soon.